Evelyn signed the order in 3 seconds. A worn-down garage at the edge of the city. She did not read the address, did not ask who owned it, and did not pause. To her, it was nothing but a small square erased from Meridian Motors' expansion plan. Her pen moved on. She had 46 more signatures before lunch. But behind those 4 dust-covered walls waited something Elijah had kept hidden for 6 years. A complete operational engine prototype, and with it, every piece of evidence proving that Evelyn's $2 billion empire had been built on ground that was never truly hers. What happens when the most powerful woman in the room finally comes face to face with proof she cannot explain away? The garage sat on the corner of a quiet industrial block, wedged between a closed print shop and a freight depot that operated 3 days a week. From the outside, it announced nothing. A hand-painted sign above the rolling steel door read, Elijah's Auto, Independent Engine Service. The letters slightly uneven, the kind of sign a man paints himself on a Saturday afternoon because hiring someone else seems beside the point. A single power line ran to the building, 1 ventilation fan was mounted in the side wall, and a strip of fluorescent lights was visible through the gap at the bottom of the door when Elijah arrived before sunrise each morning. Inside, the space was narrow but ordered in a way that had nothing to do with tidiness and everything to do with precision. Tools arranged by function on pegboard racks, each one traced in permanent marker so any misplaced item was immediately visible. Along the back wall, a handwritten color-coded chart mapped engine performance variables across different operating temperatures, the kind of visual aid a man builds for himself when the system in his head needs an external reference. Nothing in the garage was new. Everything in it worked. On the morning that would mark the beginning of everything, Elijah was diagnosing a transmission fault on a late-model SUV belonging to a contractor who had driven the truck until the problem could no longer be ignored. 3 shops had already looked at the vehicle and quoted a full assembly replacement. Elijah listened to the engine idle for 40 seconds, placed one hand flat on the valve cover, then walked to his workbench and pulled out a hand-drawn schematic he had built from memory and measurement over 2 years of independent diagnostic work. He circled a single component, a pressure relief valve, $17 at the parts counter, 20 minutes to install. The contractor watched from the doorway with the look of someone deciding whether to believe what he was seeing. Elijah did not explain and did not elaborate. He offered to test after installation and let the results speak for itself, which it always did. What the contractor could not see, and what no customer had ever asked about, was the section of the garage behind the heavy canvas curtain that ran floor to ceiling across the rear wall, secured with a mechanical padlock, never labeled, never discussed. On the workbench near the small office corner, a folded envelope sat against the base of a lamp. The Meridian Motors logo was printed in dark blue on the upper left corner, small and precise. Elijah had received it 4 days ago, opened it the same evening, read through 3 pages of legal language, and folded it back exactly as it had arrived. He looked at it now the way a man looks at a piece of weather he has been expecting, not surprised, not afraid, only noting it. 6 years earlier, in a glass conference room on the 38th floor of the Meridian headquarters tower, Evelyn had stood at the head of a long table and looked at him the way an accountant looks at a figure that does not belong in the column where it appears. Her voice had been even and quiet. "You know the reason," she had said, not a question, not an explanation. Elijah had sat with that sentence for a moment, then stood, pushed his chair back without scraping it against the floor, and walked out. He did not argue. He had understood, even then, that arguing was not the point. The point was that she needed him gone, and he was going. What he took with him when he left, she did not know. That evening, Elijah brewed coffee, sat at his workbench for a long time without moving, then stood, walked to the curtain at the back, unlocked it, and looked at what was inside. He stood there for 2 full minutes, then went back to his coffee and began to think. The 42nd floor of the Meridian Motors headquarters was designed to make investors feel they had arrived somewhere significant. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced south and west, flooding the main conference room with light that shifted gold in the late afternoon, and the furniture was chosen to read as serious rather than expensive, a distinction that cost considerably more to achieve. On the morning the expansion plan was formally presented to the board and the lead underwriting team, Evelyn stood at the center of the room and spoke from a 4-page summary she had memorized, referring to the document only once when a board member asked for a specific figure. The presentation lasted 41 minutes, and at the end of it, 3 of the 5 institutional investors had verbally committed to anchor positions in the upcoming initial public offering. The number on the table was $2 billion. The asset at the center of everything was the Adaptive Compression Engine, ACE in the company's internal language, a proprietary combustion technology Meridian had successfully patented, one that delivered a fuel efficiency gain of 31% over standard architecture across a broad range of operating temperatures and whose patent held in 44 markets. The underwriters had verified the intellectual property position independently. It was clean, it was airtight. It was by every measure available to every party in that room Meridian's. Lucas sat at the far end of the table in his role as Chief Technical Officer, presenting the production scale-up roadmap for the ACE manufacturing run. He spoke with the smooth competence of a man who had been in rooms like this many times and knew how to occupy the space between technical precision and investor accessibility. Midway through his presentation, the projection screen displayed a cross-sectional engineering diagram of the ACE core, the valve timing geometry, the adaptive compression ratio housing, the thermal regulation architecture. Lucas was pointing to the slide when he looked down at his notebook for a moment. Just one moment. He found his place in his notes and continued, and no one in the room noticed the pause. The second half of the meeting shifted to the infrastructure expansion plan, a series of acquisitions along the city's outer belt for a new research and development campus. The legal team presented the acquisition and demolition schedule for properties falling within the development perimeter. Warehouses, independent workshops, small commercial units, a total of 47 addresses. Evelyn took the bound packet and opened it at the signature page. First page, 4 commercial warehouse leases she signed. Second page, 9 light industrial units she signed. Third page, line 11, a property on the corner of an industrial block in the outer district, listed as Elijah's Auto Independent Engine Service. She signed and moved to line 12 without looking up. She had no reason to. When the meeting concluded and the room had cleared, she stood briefly at the window, looking out at the outer districts hazy and indistinct in the early light. 3 weeks to the offering. She had done the work. She did not think about the garage. She had already moved past it. The black sedan arrived at 9:22 in the morning 2 days after the board meeting. The man who stepped out wore a gray suit and carried a flat leather briefcase, and he walked to the garage with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who has delivered official documents to reluctant recipients many times and has long since stopped expecting resistance. He introduced himself as a representative of Meridian's Property Acquisition Legal Division, placed 3 folded pages on the workbench without being asked to sit, and explained briefly and correctly that the property was subject to acquisition under the commercial expansion easement, that the authorized occupant had 72 hours to vacate and surrender the premises, that compensation had been calculated at the municipal assessed value, and that any appeal filed after signature would not be considered. Then he set a business card on top of the 3 pages and waited. Elijah read all 3 pages standing up, did not rush, turned the second page slowly and finished at the bottom of the third. He folded the papers back along their original creases, set them on the bench, and looked at the man. "Who signed this order?" he said. The man said, "Executive authorization, the full board." Elijah nodded once. "All right," he said. The representative picked up his briefcase and left. For several minutes after the sedan had pulled away, Elijah stood in the middle of the garage floor without moving. The fluorescent light above the workbench hummed faintly. Outside, a truck passed on the street, and the sounds of the ordinary world continued as though nothing had shifted. But something had clarified. The way a landscape clarifies after fog lifts, not changed but suddenly visible. He walked to the canvas curtain at the back of the garage, unlocked the padlock, pulled the curtain aside and stepped in. The room was small, perhaps 15 square meters. In the center, mounted on a fabricated steel test stand, sat the engine, not beautiful in the way that showroom machinery is beautiful, but functional and dense and completely itself. A direct injection combustion assembly with a variable compression ratio housing, adaptive valve timing architecture, and a thermal management configuration that no published engineering text had yet described in the arrangement before which Elijah now stood. Around the room, metal shelving held 14 bound technical journals, each spine labeled by date in his handwriting, the earliest going back 7 years. On a small work table against the far wall, an older desktop computer with a fixed external hard drive stored the complete development record. Every test run, every measurement, every iteration, every result. Elijah had not built this in response to anything Meridian had done. He had built it because the problem had interested him, because the solution had existed in his mind before he had the resources to realize it, and because when he had finally had the time and the tools, he had built it slowly and correctly and in private, not from paranoia, but from precision. He had needed to be certain before bringing it forward. Now someone had decided the clock on his behalf. He sat on a low stool beside the engine, reached for his phone, and called a number he had not dialed in nearly 2 years. Diana answered on the second ring, her voice alert in the way of someone who has trained herself to come awake quickly. Elijah did not offer a greeting or a preamble. "They're demolishing my building," he said. "The thing I told you about 3 years ago, the prototype. It's here intact, and I have 72 hours. Do you want to see it?" The pause on Diana's end lasted exactly 3 seconds. "When?" she said. She was a financial and technical investigative reporter who had spent the better part of 2 years building a case against Meridian Motors from the investment side, tracking inconsistencies between the declared development timeline for ACE and the actual internal project records she had obtained through a source who no longer worked at the company. She had enough to suspect fraud. She did not have enough to publish. When Elijah had first reached out to her 3 years earlier, she had listened carefully, taken notes, and told him she needed more than a story. She needed evidence that existed in physical form, in the world, verifiable by independent experts. He had told her it existed. She had been patient. Patience, it turned out, had a 72-hour window. Diana arrived at the garage the following morning before the block had fully come to life. Elijah led her through the main space without stopping to the curtain at the back, pulled it aside, and stepped back. She walked into the room and stood in front of the engine on its test stand for almost a full minute without speaking. Then she set her bag on the work table, took out her laptop, and opened a browser tab she had visited so many times it loaded before she finished typing the address. The public filing page for Meridian's ACE patent registration. She began to read from the filing while Elijah stood beside her. Neither spoke much for the first 20 minutes. Diana read sections of the patent specification aloud in a low voice, and Elijah pointed to corresponding pages in the technical journals on the shelf. The adaptive compression ratio housing, identical geometry down to the degree of angular variance in the primary seal ring. The valve timing actuation sequence. The same staged release architecture, the same thermal threshold triggers described in the patent in the exact language Elijah had used in his journal 4 years before the patent was filed. The fuel injection calibration profile, a configuration so specific it could not have been independently derived without the preliminary work documented in the earliest of the 14 bound volumes. Diana stopped typing. She looked at the engine. Then she looked at Elijah. "Walk me through the timeline," she said. He told her without dramatizing it. 7 years ago, while employed at Meridian in a senior engineering role, he had begun developing the ACE concept independently. Outside working hours, using personal equipment at a leased workspace maintained separately from his employment. The engine concept was his before Meridian. He had filed an initial patent application 5 years before the current date, which had been rejected on grounds of insufficient supporting documentation. He had filed a corrected and expanded application 14 months later, but before the second application was processed, Meridian had terminated his employment, citing misappropriation of company intellectual property. The termination had been swift and total. The internal accusation had effectively frozen his legal standing while Meridian's own attorneys moved. 18 months after his termination, Meridian's ACE patent had been approved. Elijah's second application had, at some point in the intervening period, been recorded in the federal system as withdrawn. He had never withdrawn it. Diana typed without looking up. "Who at Meridian had access to your original filing?" Elijah said, "Someone who knew it existed and had the authority to make it disappear before it became an obstacle." The question of who was not yet answerable from the evidence in this room, but the question of what and when was answerable clearly with the materials stacked on those shelves and loaded on the hard drive within reach. What remained was the problem of time. The physical prototype was the cornerstone of any legal claim. A digital archive standing alone could be challenged as a reconstruction drawn backward from the patented designs. Without the prototype, the argument had gaps a sufficiently aggressive attorney could widen into doubt. Diana looked at the clock on her laptop screen. Just under 48 hours remained on Elijah's notice period. "I need a name," she said. "Someone inside Meridian who can put this on the record. Without a witness, the legal process takes years. The IPO closes in 3 weeks." Elijah leaned against the doorframe and looked at the engine for a long moment. "I know someone who knows everything," he said. "He's never spoken before. I'm not sure what changes that." Diana closed her laptop. "Then we start with what we have, and we move the prototype tomorrow night." The crew arrived at 7:40 in the morning on the second day. 4 hours ahead of the schedule Elijah had been given. The lead van carried 2 representatives from Meridian's property division and 1 city-contracted compliance officer. Behind the van, a flatbed truck and 2 work vehicles. The crew chief had a clipboard and a professionally cheerful energy that did not engage with whether the people being displaced wanted to be displaced. Elijah was already standing outside the main rolling door when they pulled up, wearing his work clothes, canvas trousers, a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled once, boots with the toe caps worn pale from years of use, and he looked like a man who had been awake for some time and had decided how to use the morning. The compliance officer approached first as protocol required and read from a printed summary of the acquisition order. Elijah listened without interrupting. When the officer finished, Elijah said, calmly and without argument, that there was a procedural deficiency in the enforcement notice. He had filed a formal objection through the city's administrative review system the previous evening, and under the municipal code, enforcement action could not proceed while an administrative objection was pending without a written determination. He produced the filing confirmation from his shirt pocket, folded once, and handed it over without expression. The compliance officer looked at the paper, then at Elijah, then at the paper again, and stepped away to make a phone call. The work crew stood near their vehicles. Elijah stood near his door. No one spoke across the distance. It was a long 10 minutes. The second vehicle to arrive was a black company sedan. Lucas stepped out from the passenger side and stood for a moment on the sidewalk before looking across the lot at the garage front. His eyes found the hand-painted sign, Elijah's Auto, Independent Engine Service. He read it once. He read it a second time. Then he became very still, in the way a person becomes still when something they thought was in the past turns out to be present. Elijah saw him at the same moment. Across the width of the lot, through the dusty morning light, the two men looked at each other for the first time in 6 years. There was no movement from either of them. Elijah did not step forward. Lucas did not look away. 6 years of silence occupied the space between them, and the silence said more than either man could have managed in words. Lucas looked like a person who had just remembered something he had been arranging his entire life around not thinking about directly. Elijah's expression did not change. He looked at Lucas with the particular absence of anger that is in its own way more devastating than anger. There was no accusation in it. There was only recognition, and a kind of patience that had lasted 6 years and appeared prepared to last longer. Lucas eventually crossed the lot. He stopped 6 feet from Elijah and for a moment said nothing, looking at the garage entrance the way a man looks at a door he has been avoiding his whole adult life. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, the voice of someone managing a great deal beneath the surface. "I didn't know," he said. "Not this property. I didn't know it was yours." Elijah looked at him for a moment with the same unhurried calm. "But you knew other things," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a plain statement of fact offered without anger, and that made it heavier than accusation, because there was nothing in it to push back against. Lucas did not answer. He looked at the sign one more time, then at the ground, then back at Elijah, with the expression of a man standing at the edge of a decision he has been approaching for a very long time, and has now, quite unexpectedly, run out of road to walk before making it. Inside the garage, Diana had been working since 6 in the morning. While Elijah managed the legal delay outside, she worked in the back room making copies. 3 external drives, a cloud backup through an encrypted server, and a printed verification set sealed in a courier envelope addressed to the intellectual property attorney she had called 2 nights before. She worked methodically and without wasted motion, the way she always worked when the hours were countable and the material was irreplaceable. By the time the compliance officer returned with word that the objection had been verified as valid and enforcement was suspended for a minimum of 24 additional hours, Diana had finished. She walked out through the side door with a canvas bag over one shoulder and nodded once at Elijah as she passed him on the sidewalk. The work crew loaded back into their vehicles. Lucas stood for a moment longer near the entrance to the lot, looking at the garage with an expression that had moved past its original blankness into something that might, given a little more time, become a decision. Elijah watched him go, then turned back toward his garage, went inside, put on a pot of coffee, and sat at his workbench looking at the tools on the pegboard wall, each one in its traced outline, each one where it was supposed to be. He had built this place over 6 years, not because he had given up on what was in the back room, but because doing good work in the meantime was its own form of proof. The countdown clock had not stopped. 24 hours remained. The call came at 1:17 in the morning. The number was not in Elijah's contacts, but something about the time and the silence before the first word made him answer in full attention rather than the half-awareness of a man pulled from sleep. "It's Lucas," the voice said. Elijah sat up in the dark and said nothing, which was its own kind of response. "I have something you need," Lucas continued, his voice controlled but not comfortable. the voice of a person who has rehearsed a difficult conversation and is now discovering that rehearsal is not the same as the actual thing. Project Absorption. That's the internal code name they used for the process of integrating your design into the company architecture. I have the full file, authorization chain, named signatories, dates and timestamps on every internal communication, the original directive to have your patent application flagged for administrative delay. It goes all the way up. He paused. Elijah held the phone against his ear and looked at the ceiling. Why now, he said. There was a pause on the other end that lasted long enough to be honest. Because I saw your sign today, Lucas said. Not an elaborate justification. Just the truth, arriving 6 years late and apparently finding the door still open. They talked for 40 minutes. Lucas had been at Meridian since before Elijah's departure, hired as a technical lead, elevated to chief technical officer in the period following Elijah's dismissal, handed the ACE file fully formed and told to manage its development into production. He had known from the first week that the technical journals accompanying the file transfer were not Meridian's work. The architecture was too internally consistent, too precisely documented for a corporation's iterative R&D output. It had the character of a single mind working at full intensity over years. He had understood what he was looking at. He had made his choice. I can't undo what I did, Lucas said, but I can tell you what I know in writing on record, in front of whoever needs to hear it. Elijah asked his condition. Lucas stated it plainly. He would sign a formal declaration and appear as a cooperating witness only after the physical prototype had been verified by an independent expert and documented through official legal channels. He needed to know that his testimony was not the only proof, that it would be corroborated by material evidence that preceded his account. Then he said, "The IPO is the day after tomorrow. If you are going to do this, it has to be tomorrow night. Once the offering closes, Meridian's legal resources triple overnight. They will tie this up for years if they get past the IPO." Elijah said he understood. After the call ended, he went to his workbench, turned on the light, and pulled a sheet of paper from the printer. He wrote a sequence of names and times. The outline of a plan worked through in longhand, the way he always worked through complex problems. Not because writing it made it more real, but because laying it out in sequence revealed where the vulnerabilities were. There was one core vulnerability. The prototype was still inside the sealed garage, and Lucas had access to the building's new electronic lock system through his administrative credentials as chief technical officer, a window that would close the moment his cooperation with Meridian ended. Which meant the window to use that access was approximately 18 hours wide. He called Diana at 2 in the morning. She answered immediately as though she had been waiting. When he finished, she said, "I know where the IPO event is tomorrow night. Every person who needs to hear this will be in the same room." Elijah considered that for a moment. "That's not where I plan to take it," he said. "I know," Diana said, "but it's where it will do the most." The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was the kind of silence that happens when a person accepts the shape of something they have been working toward for 6 years, finally arriving in a form they could not have predicted but recognized completely. "Tomorrow night," Elijah said. The Grand Meridian Hotel occupied the top 4 floors of the tallest building in the city's financial district, and on the night of the pre-IPO investor reception, its 32nd floor ballroom was arranged to project exactly the kind of confidence that moves capital. Round tables with white linen, soft directional lighting over a stage at the far end of the room, a reception bar that was, for the first hour, doing serious work. The guest list included 200 institutional investors, 14 managing directors from the lead underwriting firms, representatives from the Regional Securities Exchange Authority, and approximately 30 financial journalists with the credentials that got them past the door and into the orbit of people willing to talk about the biggest technology offering the city had seen in a decade. Evelyn moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms like this. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a quality of attention that made each person she spoke with feel briefly that they were the most relevant person present. She was 3 weeks from a closed offering. She had built the machine. Tonight was the part where the machine did what machines do when they are built correctly. She had no reason to feel anything other than composed. She did not feel anything other than composed. At the far end of the room, above the stage, the Meridian Motors logo was projected in soft light against a dark backdrop. Clean, monumental, exactly as she had intended it to look to the people in this room. She glanced at it once, allowed herself one brief moment of private satisfaction, and moved on to the next table. Lucas arrived at the event in his capacity as Chief Technical Officer, expected to deliver a 7-minute technical briefing shaped for an investor audience, and to be available for one-on-one conversations throughout the evening with investors who wanted to understand the engineering fundamentals of the ACE before committing capital. He had delivered this kind of briefing many times. He knew the material. He had prepared the slides. He had not prepared to use them. 3 blocks from the hotel, in a rented transport van parked against the curb of a side street, Elijah sat in the passenger seat with the engine off. In the cargo space behind him, secured on a padded equipment dolly, was the prototype. He had removed it from the garage at 11:45 the previous night, with Lucas's remote access unlocking the Meridian electronic lock, and a team of 4, Elijah, Diana, the intellectual property attorney, and an independent mechanical engineer who had been called in on a night's notice, and who, upon seeing the engine, had spent 20 minutes in near silence before signing the verification form, had documented every detail of the prototype's physical configuration, cross-referenced against 3 independent copies of the technical journals and the hardware documentation. The verification report, signed by the independent engineer, was already in the attorney's briefcase. Diana entered the hotel at 8:45 with her press credentials and a courier bag containing 12 sealed document packets. Each packet held a 16-page summary, a side-by-side technical comparison of Elijah's dated journals against the filed ACE patent specifications, the project absorption internal file from Lucas, and the independent engineer's verification report. She had worked out which 12 journalists in the room were the right 12. She found them in the first 20 minutes, said very little, and left 1 packet with each. At 9:15, the event's program host called the room to attention and introduced the evening's technical presentation. Lucas walked to the stage. He stood at the podium for a moment before opening his laptop. The room was quiet in the way a room full of people with money becomes quiet when they expect to be told something they want to know. The projection screen behind him showed the Meridian corporate header. Lucas looked at his prepared slides, and then he looked up at the room. "I was asked to speak tonight about the engineering foundations of the adaptive compression engine," he said. His voice was clear and without tremor, the voice of a person who has made a decision that has relieved him of the anxiety of making it. The ACE technology is central to this offering. Every investor in this room has been told that Meridian Motors developed and owns that technology. I have been one of the people telling you that. He paused for exactly 2 seconds. That is not accurate. I know because I am the person who was handed the original work and told to make it Meridian's. Tonight I am choosing not to continue. The room did not react immediately. There was a 3-second lag, the kind that happens when a statement is so structurally unexpected that the processing of its implications runs slightly behind the processing of its words. Then quietly and rapidly, the room changed. A dozen conversations started in low voices. Several investors set down their glasses. The Securities Exchange representatives at the nearest table exchanged a look with a quality of professional recognition. Evelyn was standing near the left side bar. She heard Lucas from across the room. She heard every word. She set her glass on a passing tray and stood very still. The side doors of the ballroom opened. Elijah walked in, pushing a commercial equipment dolly on which the prototype sat beneath a black cloth cover. He was still in his work clothes. He had not changed, and it had not seemed relevant. The room parted slightly as he moved toward the center floor, not in the theatrical way of a prepared entrance, but in the practical way that happens when a large object moves through a crowded space, and people step aside because it is easier. He stopped in the center of the room. He reached down and pulled the black cloth away. The prototype stood there in the hotel lighting on its fabricated steel test stand, exactly as it had stood in the back room of his garage for 6 years. It was not polished, it did not glow under directional lights the way Meridian's manufactured components did. It was a working object, dense, complete, honest. Every mechanical engineer in the room understood what they were looking at within 10 seconds. Elijah looked across the space at Evelyn. She was looking back at him. She had not moved. For the first time in his adult recollection, she did not have the expression of a person who is already formulating the next step. He did not cross the room to her. He did not raise his voice. He spoke clearly enough to be heard and deliberately enough that there would be no ambiguity. You signed the order to demolish my building without knowing what was inside it. That was the only mistake you made. He held her gaze for a moment. It was enough. Evelyn said nothing. Not because she lacked the capability, because there was, for the first time, nothing that would help. The Securities Exchange representatives were already standing. Diana was already photographing the prototype in the room. 14 journalists had opened their notebooks. A legal director from one of the underwriting firms was moving toward the exit, speaking quietly into a phone. Elijah stepped back from the prototype and waited. He had been waiting for 6 years. A few more minutes was nothing at all. 3 months passed the way consequential months tend to pass, with a great deal of legal procedural noise in the foreground and a slow, nearly imperceptible shift of facts and positions underneath it. The IPO was suspended the morning after the event at the Grand Meridian, on the formal recommendation of the Securities Exchange Authority pending a patent ownership investigation. The underwriting firms withdrew from the timeline without public statement. The institutional investors exercised their exit options quietly and efficiently. Elijah's second patent application was reinstated through a federal administrative review process, and the documentation he provided, 14 technical journals, the complete hardware record, the independent engineer's verification, the project absorption internal file from Lucas, and the original time-stamped filing confirmation that had somehow survived the system purge, constituted what the presiding examiner later described as a comprehensive evidentiary record sufficient to establish prior development. The physical prototype was held in certified storage as evidence. The ACE patent was placed in administrative trust during the adjudication period, meaning neither Meridian nor Elijah could license or commercialize the technology until the ownership question was formally resolved. Elijah had agreed to this condition without hesitation. He could wait. Evelyn resigned the chief executive position at a board meeting called on 10 days' notice, in a vote that was unanimous and conducted without public spectacle. She was not escorted from the building. She walked out of the Meridian Motors headquarters tower on a Wednesday afternoon with the composed expression of a person who has accepted the shape of what is happening and chosen to move through it without resistance. Federal investigators with the Financial Crimes Unit were 2 weeks behind her, with a case that Lucas's testimony had accelerated considerably. The civil and criminal proceedings that followed would take years. The outcome was not yet written, but the architecture of the empire, the $2 billion structure built on an authorization no one was supposed to trace, was already coming apart at the load-bearing joints. Lucas accepted a cooperation agreement that came with full disclosure, documented accountability, and a significant reduction in personal criminal exposure. He left the company the same week, his name appearing in the investigation records as a cooperating witness rather than a principal actor. Whether this was justice or partial justice or something more complicated than either word could contain, no one who had been close to the events seemed interested in debating. He had come forward when it mattered. He had come forward late. Both of these things were true simultaneously and would remain so. Diana's investigative account ran simultaneously in 3 national publications and was structured as a long-form documentary record rather than a breaking news story, methodical, precisely sourced, constructed to hold up in court as a reference document as much as to inform a general readership. She spent 3 more months following the federal proceedings before moving to her next assignment. The Meridian story had taken 2 years to build. She had learned, in those 2 years, to trust the kind of patience that does not announce itself. The demolition order on Elijah's garage was suspended indefinitely when Meridian's development project was placed under administrative review as part of the broader investigation. The rolling steel door was unsealed on a Tuesday morning, the Meridian electronic lock removed and replaced with Elijah's original mechanical padlock, and the building returned to its former operating condition without ceremony. He repainted the front sign on a Saturday. The same brush, the same colors, the same slightly uneven lettering that had always made it look like what it was. A man's own hand, his own work, his own name on a building he had made into something over 6 years of ordinary mornings. He rehung the tool racks, checked the alignment on the fluorescent strips, and brewed a pot of coffee on the small electric burner by the side workbench. Diana arrived mid-morning with 2 coffees from the place across the block and stood for a moment in the open doorway, looking at the main garage and then at the back room, the curtain gone, the test stand empty, the shelves holding only the bound journals, and the old desktop computer that had not yet been moved to storage. The room looked smaller without the engine in it, and also somehow cleaner, the way a place looks when it has finally released the thing it was holding. She leaned against the doorframe for a moment, taking in the whole of the garage, the pegboard walls, the color-coded chart, the tools in their traced outlines, and she thought that for a place that had held something this significant for this long, it looked remarkably like what it had always claimed to be. A working garage on a quiet industrial block belonging to a man who fixed engines. "What do you do with the Ace now?" she asked. Elijah took the coffee she handed him and looked out through the open rolling door at the street beyond, the freight depot across the way, the pale morning light on the asphalt, the ordinary world doing its ordinary work. "Build it properly," he said. This time, not to prove anything. From the main body of the garage, the sound of a running engine came through the air, a four-cylinder midsize that a customer had dropped off the previous afternoon, needing a diagnosis. It idled with a faint irregularity, the kind of subtle misfiring that only certain people can hear in the first place. Elijah turned toward the sound. He set his coffee on the bench, picked up a diagnostic worksheet from the stack, and walked back into the garage. The door was open. The work was there. Nothing had been taken that could not be reclaimed, and nothing needed to be said about it now that the morning had already said everything.